I don't want no oil, a spoiling my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things, a-creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes!
Good morning, Toledo, and good afternoon, Columbus, and hello to those of you listening on the internet, wherever and whenever you are. My name is Joe DeMare, and you have been one of the lucky ones who managed to tune into For a Green Future. For a Green Future is a show where we talk about ecology and the environment. We talk about them in the ways that they affect you, your wealth, your health, your happiness, and your family's happiness. And we try to do it with a little bit of humor here and there, and we try to give you a variety of interesting ecological and environmental stories. And this week is no exception. We have an interview coming up. It's a pre-recorded interview with Karl Grossman, who has someone who's been active in the environmental movement for many years. And Karl's going to be talking to us about the dangers of nukes in space. I mean, as if nukes on the ground weren't bad enough, now they're talking about nukes in space. So that'll be coming up actually a little bit earlier than usual because it's a little bit longer interview than our usual 15 minutes. But so we'll be going to that fairly soon. And then we'll be hearing from our wonderful sponsors and patrons. We'll be talking to our co-host, Rebecca Wood, and then I got a bunch of environmental stuff to update you on, a lot of developments on a lot of different stories. But first, I just wanted to talk a little bit about an experience I had. Right now we're in Boston, in the Boston area, and it's been very interesting living this close to the ocean. I've never done this before. And I had kind of a cool experience. It was low tide the other day, and it was a really low tide. And so I was able to walk way out into the bay where it's normally all covered in water. And I could tell that because the sea plants were laying there on the ground, the ones that are normally floating in the water. And I spotted a marine mussel. Yes, I spotted a mussel right there, just sitting there on the ground. So I actually harvested it. I actually picked it and brought it into the house, and you have to pull the little fibers that they attach themselves to the rocks with. They call it a beard around here. You got to pull the beard off, and then I cooked it and ate it. And it was delicious. It was really cool. And it just reminds me that, all the stuff that we do have, all this bounty that we get to enjoy, all this food we as Americans eat, and we eat tons of food. We eat more than most other cultures. We spend it all eating. But it all ultimately comes from nature. I mean, even if it's grown on a factory farm, or even if it's in a greenhouse or something like that, it's really the natural ecosystem that provides it for us. And it's just kind of cool to get a reminder like that so directly, because I've eaten mussels in restaurants lots of times, marine mussels, but I've never actually just gone out and picked one for myself. It was kind of cool. And it got me to thinking a little bit about mussels, and there's a few interesting facts about mussels I'd like to share with you. One is that there's a big difference between freshwater and marine mussels, ocean mussels. The freshwater mussels taste terrible, apparently. I've never eaten one, but I've read a lot of reviews that A, they taste terrible, B, they're threatened. They're over 70% of them, of the freshwater species, are in decline, although the marine species seem to be holding their own pretty well. So don't pick any freshwater mussels there, and if you see any in Lake Erie there or anywhere in Ohio. And there's over 300 species of freshwater mussels in North America, more than anywhere else on the planet, although they are all being threatened. And one of the big threats, of course, is the zebra mussel, which is an invasive species. But that's a whole nother topic. That's the topic for a whole nother show. But one interesting thing is that mussels are very long-lived. Some can live up to 100 years. And, 60 and 70-year-old mussels are not unusual. So there's something to think about the next time you're eating a mussel, is that mussel could actually be older than you are. So I think, actually, Russell, like I said, we're going to the interview a little bit early because it's a little bit longer than usual, because Karl Grossman sure had a lot to say. He's been in this business for about 50 years in terms of reporting on the environment and talking about environmental issues. So he had a lot to say, and I actually pared the interview down quite a bit. It was originally a full half hour, but I got it down to just over 20. So, Russell, are we ready? Have you got the interview queued up there? All right. You could tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, your name, and what organizations you're with, and so forth.
Well, I'm an investigative reporter. I've been doing that kind of work for many years. In fact,
if you have any comments about this or any
just before we started, you were mentioning the Ohio connection, and I was inspired to go into investigative reporting by the investigative reporters that I met and I work with. I was just a copy boy at the Cleveland Press. It was an internship done through Antioch College, where I was attending. Man, I just thought that what they were doing was a corny story. Above the entrance of the Cleveland Press was the motto of the paper, give light and the people will find their own way. I would get calls from various, people suffering from, expressing horror stories, people suffering from all kinds of terrible things. I would pass on the information to these investigative reporters, and a few weeks later you'd see the raw information I had gotten on the phone documented. And the amazing thing to me was the publication of these facts, of this information, the giving of this light by these investigative reporters resolved these situations about half the time. And so I trekked back to New York, where I'm from, and pursued a journalism career. And I became an investigative reporter at the Long Island Press, which a comparable newspaper to the Cleveland Press. And then when the Long Island Press went out in 1977, about the same time, incidentally, the Cleveland Press went out, I got into teaching. I became a professor at the State University of New York College at Old Westbury, which in large part actually was based on Antioch College. Indeed, Antioch students were in the planning committee for SUNY Old Westbury. I've been there for 42 years.
Yeah, that's great. And I think a lot of Ohioans don't really realize just what kind of a gem we had down there in Yellow Springs with Antioch College. That's gone on to influence the whole country in a lot of profound ways. But talking about your Counterpunch article that was published this past week, the big push for nukes in space. I read that article. It read like a science fiction story, really. So I'll let you give us a little background on nukes in space, and then maybe we could talk a little bit about what the insane mad scientist plans that Elon Musk is proposing for our next door neighbor in space here.
It's mad science at its worst. maybe just for some background, how I got into the issue of nukes in space goes way back to 1985. And I was reading a little government document. Department of Energy Insider was its name, and it spoke about how in 1986 there'd be two shuttle shots, one involving the Challenger, in which both the space shuttles would be carrying aloft plutonium-fueled space probes, and they would send them out into space from orbit. If they got into orbit, obviously Challenger didn't make it up into orbit. And I had written a book published in just a few years before that, in 1980, called Cover Up: What You're Not Supposed to Know About Nuclear Power. Where I live on Long Island in New York, the local utility and nuclear promoters, and also the National Nuclear Laboratory here in Long Island, Brookhaven National Laboratory, were pushing for many nuclear power plants. And thus, we're talking way back in the 70s, this was a big story. And so I sure knew about plutonium and knew that it's been regarded as the most toxic, the deadliest of all radioactive substances. And then I see plutonium on a space probe, which is going to be aboard the shuttle. And I sent the Freedom of Information Act request to NASA, the Department of Energy, which provides these nuclear systems, it turns out, to NASA, and the various national nuclear laboratories involved, Oak Ridge, Los Alamos, and so forth. And I didn't think much of it. You know, I'm not technophobic. I love to take, this is pre-COVID, of course, airplane rides and get a window seat. And I could live without my laptop, but I mean, plutonium, what if there would be an accident? So my letter said, what if there'd be an accident on launch? Give me information about an accident in the lower atmosphere, the upper atmosphere, the impacts, the consequences, if that plutonium on that space probe, on the shuttle, would be released. And it took months to get any information, about 10 months. And I had to kick and scream and write columns. I have a column in Long Island newspapers. I write for many magazines these days. I write a lot on the internet. And finally, in late 85, I got information that, well, there would be consequences, but what NASA and the Department of Energy did was redacted the consequences. They must have they must have used a pint of whiteout to take out the numbers of the people killed, left with cancer and so forth, if the plutonium was released, and claimed that the chances, however, of a catastrophic shuttle accident was 1 in 100,000 because of the high reliability. Those are the words, the high reliability of the space shuttle. I was actually driving to work to teach investigative reporting, first class of the year in 1986, when I hear on the car radio that the Challenger had blown up. First thought was, wow, what if it would have been the May mission, the mission on which it was scheduled to loft this plutonium-fueled space probe? I jumped into an appliance store along the Long Island Expressway called The Nation magazine on a payphone. This is before the days of cell phones, telling the folks there, did you know about the Challenger's next mission, this nuclear mission? They didn't. They said, would you write an editorial for us? I did. It was entitled The Lethal Shuttle. It appeared on page 1 in The Nation. And that began, now it's been 35 years, of writing pieces, doing TV documentaries. I've done 3, including Nukes in Space, the nuclearization and weaponization of the heavens, which was, distributed around the world. Many magazine pieces, a couple of books, one called The Wrong Stuff, the space program's nuclear threat to our planet, and a second one, Weapons in Space, because it turns out there's a big connection between the NASA use of nuclear material and the military's desire to, back to the 80s, Star Wars was predicated, though we didn't know much about that now, but I quickly realized what the basis of Star Wars was energy was.
Now,
orbiting battle platforms.
When you say Star Wars, Karl, though, you're not talking about the movie franchise. You're talking about the Strategic Defense Initiative that Reagan started to try to block.
Yeah, when he got in, this was the SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars, and it was predicated, it turns out, on orbiting battle platforms with hypervelocity guns, particle beam, and laser weapons, and they needed such enormous amounts of power that also on those battle platforms would be nuclear reactors. In fact, the head of Star Wars at one point, General Abramson, said at a conference that without reactors in space to power these weapons, we're going to have a long light cord, an extension cord, down to Earth, bringing up power. This book I wrote, Weapons in Space, introduction by Dr. Michio Kaku, explains how NASA, though created as a civilian agency in 1958, the year after the Soviets launched Sputnik, learned quickly where the money is in Washington, D.C., and that's the Pentagon, and thus had dual missions. I mean, you had many shuttle missions where there were 7 colonels aboard, and you didn't kind of find out what they were up doing in space. And it wasn't just dual missions in terms of personnel, but dual missions in terms of the mechanics of the mission. And the military wanted to use nukes in space, and NASA, even though it didn't have to, it turns out, used reactors and what are called RTGs, radioisotope thermoelectric generators, in space. And the newest piece on Counterpunch is a piece about how there's a push now harder than ever for nukes in space, for the use of nuclear in space, not just for the RTGs. All they did, actually, they just generated a minor amount of wattage in electricity to provide electricity for the systems aboard those space probes. Less than a hairdryer would use. That's why solar would. In fact, Juno was a spacecraft sent by NASA just a few years ago to Jupiter, still up there. And instead of using RTGs, uses 3 solar panels at Jupiter, which is a planet which has added 1/100th of the solar light that we get on Earth. But still, it's enough to provide energy through solar panels to the instruments.
All right, let's back up just a little bit here, Karl. So these RTGs, what they are is basically just lumps of plutonium, right? That just give off heat as they decay, and then they capture that heat and use that to generate electricity, which in itself is a pretty inefficient way to do things. But we're concerned. The concern is that if some of this plutonium, if on the way up there's an accident like the Challenger explosion, and that plutonium gets exploded in the atmosphere and it comes sprinkling back down on us, it's going to hurt a lot of people. It's going to cause a lot of cancers and cause a lot of problems. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and this is not a sky is falling scenario. I mean, in 1964, a satellite, at that time, satellites were equipped with these RTGs for onboard, again, electrical power, and the SNAP 9A did not make it to orbit, fell down back to Earth. The satellite disintegrated as it hit the atmosphere, spreading plutonium as fine particles. And this is what you don't want with plutonium, because plutonium, just a millionth of a gram of plutonium getting into someone's lung will cause lung cancer. After World War II, the Nagasaki bomb was fueled by plutonium, a man-made substance. Hiroshima bomb, highly enriched uranium. But with the discovery of the development of plutonium, essentially all our nuclear atomic bombs have plutonium fuel. The hydrogen bomb has a trigger of plutonium. And after the Manhattan Project, they were obviously concerned because some of those scientists ended up dead and ill dealing with radioactive substances, including plutonium, and they did what famously called the Beagle test. They caused beagles to inhale just a microscopic amount of plutonium, and what happened all the time? Lung cancer. So if plutonium dispersed in fine particles as dust gets into people's lungs, you got lung cancer. And indeed, the SNAP-9A accident, according to Dr. John Goffman, he was former associate director at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, long-time professor at University of California, Berkeley, and involved, actually, way back there during the Manhattan Project time in the isolation of plutonium. He long connected the SNAP-9A accident to a spike, significant spike in lung cancer on Earth, and that plutonium from that SNAP-9A got all over the place. It's a little different than the plutonium in bombs. Plutonium in bombs is plutonium-239, and has a half-life of 24,000 years. Plutonium-238, which is space use, has a half-life of 88 years. In other words, it's disintegrating so quickly that it's generating a lot of radiation. In fact, it's 280 times more radioactive than 239, but it's hot as hell. And the notion of the RTG is, as you just explained, to couple that heat in a radioisotope thermoelectric generating system to produce electricity. But whether, in terms of accidents, U.S. space program at that time in '86, when I really jumped into writing about this, doing television about it after the Challenger blew up. If that stuff would have gotten out, that it was about 24 pounds would have been on the Challenger in May, would have gotten out, and there would have been in an explosive situation, spread, as dust in Central Florida. I mean, you wouldn't want to go to Disney for a few hundred years.
Yeah. Because if the half-life is 88 years, then you got to wait 880 years before it's decayed down to a safe level again.
Generally, the factor in the multiplication of a half-life is from 10 to 20. If you want to be really conservative, it isn't just 800 and some odd years. You don't have to be concerned about the radioactivity. It has dissipated. It's really 1,600 years, which is a long time.
Oh, yeah. In human terms, right. So, in
any case...
So, kind of like we almost lost Detroit with the Fermi 1 reactor, we almost lost Disneyland with if the shuttle had been on if the plutonium had been on that Challenger instead of the next scheduled mission. Wow. So...
Yeah, and in fact, the New York Times, I once did an op-ed piece for the New York Times about these nuclear missions because they were being launched from Florida. And the headline, the Times, and in fact, my recollection, it was Dr. Goffman saying this: if there's an accident and that plutonium was released, again, as fine particles in Florida, kiss Florida goodbye. And that was the headline of the op-ed piece in the New York Times. I've heard plutonium described as the most toxic substance in the universe. I don't know about the universe, but on this planet, within our solar system in the universe, it's certainly the most toxic, the deadliest radioactive substance.
All right. Well, let's push on to another point in your article in Counterpunch, and that is what Elon Musk is planning to do to the poor defenseless planet Mars. When I read that, I was just flabbergasted. Could you tell us what he's thinking?
Well, what Musk wants to do, and he's been pushing this for actually a number of years. This isn't particularly new, though. As the piece in Counterpunch stresses, there's this big push to use nuclear in space. I mean, it's been going on for decades. But now it's enormous, and one of the things that would be slated to occur, and hold your breath, listeners, is Elon Musk's plan. He's the founder and CEO of SpaceX, And just recently now, just a few days ago from when we're recording this, a SpaceX rocket blew up in Texas in a fireball. In any case, what he wants to do, transform Mars into an Earth-like planet. And in my piece, Counterpunch, Musk, this is Business Insider, has championed the idea of launching nuclear weapons just over Mars, pole, South Pole, North Pole of Mars, since 2015. He believes it will help warm the planet and make it more hospitable for human life. It's been projected, this is another piece I cite, that it would take more than 10,000 of these nuclear bombs to carry out the Musk plan. So that's the Mars plan for that's the Musk plan for Mars.
Wow.
Musk, I mean, this guy, brilliant, developed the Tesla car. What is he thinking? I mean, it's talking mad science. And imagine if one of those reactors is on any kind of rocket, which blows up with its nuclear material aboard.
Yeah,
but in any case, the U.S. is pushing ahead harder than ever with nukes in space, including positioning, sending nuclear reactors up to the moon and to Mars, and to have them power would-be colonies on Mars. And in regard to the moon, I quote a Discover magazine, another very middle-of-the-road, science-based magazine, an article, How to Harvest Terawatts of solar power on the moon. And in fact, that article goes on to talk about a Japanese corporation, Shimuzi, gearing up to develop solar power on the moon. The photovoltaic cells themselves could be tissue thin, since the moon has no weather or air, says the article, and half of the moon is in sunlight at any one time. A huge amount of power could be energy generated on the moon. In fact, it could be beamed back to Earth, the article goes on. And just if I could jump to nuclear propulsion, because the other thing the U.S. is up to now is the idea of having nuclear reactors power. Again, this is not RTGs. They're just there to generate modest amount of electricity for instruments, onboard instruments. Now what the U.S. is talking about is actual nuclear reactors powering engines, and what's being argued is that would take astronauts to Mars much quicker. It's three months you can get to Mars with a nuclear powered propulsion system, a nuclear powered engine. It's claimed by these nuclear space promoters, but here it's unnecessary too. I mean, my piece quotes, and here I'm quoting the New Scientist magazine just recently in October, with a very extensive story about the new age of sail, its headline, and the subhead: "We are on the cusp of a new type of space travel that can take us to places no rocket could ever visit." And the piece starts with relating how 17th century astronomer Johann Kepler, observing comets, saw that their tails always pointed away from the sun, no matter which direction they were traveling. It meant to Kepler, one thing, the comets were being blown from the sun. And indeed, the article goes on, the sun produces a wind in space, and it can be harnessed. Then I go on to the Icaros spacecraft. This is Japanese spacecraft in 2010, sent up with Mylar space sails, moving in space through the power in the vacuum of space, the power generated by the sun. And only last year, the Light Sail 2 mission of the Planetary Society was launched. It's still up in space, flying with the sun's energy. And here's the last paragraph of the article. They speak of scientists who want to use these new techniques, indeed new techniques that substitute even more efficient sails for Mylar sails, for thin film sails. They want to use these new techniques of solar sails to set a course for worlds currently far beyond our reach, namely the planets orbiting our nearest star Alpha Centauri. So, I mean, you put all this together, there's no need for nukes in space. It's horrendously dangerous. And if we're going to explore space, let us do it safely. As to nuking Mars, that's utterly obscene. It's and completely insane.
Right. All right. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it at that, Karl. That was a pretty intense interview there. Thanks.
Can I add one thing? If a listener asking at this point, now what do I do about this craziness? There's an organization, the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. I had a hand in forming it in 1992, based up in Maine. Membership all over the world, has actions and conferences and all, and just connect to its website, which is space, www.space4, the numeral 4, peace.org, www.spaceforpeace.org, and get involved with the global network. And from the grassroots, hopefully we can stop this craziness.
All right. That's Karl Grossman, and as you could tell, he's a very enthusiastic speaker. Once he gets going, it was a little hard to rein him in there, but I think I did pretty well. What do you think of what Karl had to say? Give us a call at 866-240-1065 and let us know what you think about nukes in space. Are you in favor of that? Do you think that's a great idea, or do you think it's a little too risky? We shouldn't be doing that. And while you're considering calling in, one thing that's not risky is patronizing our sponsors. And For a Green Future is brought to you by the Wood County Park District. The Wood County Park District is a natural resources conservation agency. They protect natural spaces, maintain quality green spaces, provide engaging programming, and they teach people to love and respect nature. They restore wildlife habitats, and they lead outdoor adventures. And Wood County Parks protects natural spaces in Wood County for all to enjoy from 8 a.m. to 30 minutes past sunset every day of the year. And there's several ways to get a hold of them and see what's going on there with the Wood County Parks. One is to give them a call at 419-353-1897. That's 419-353-1897. Another is to go to their website, wcparks.org. It's pretty straightforward there. And you can also download their app. Just go to your favorite app store and search for WC Parks. And, of course, check them out on Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms. And For a Green Future is also brought to you by our sponsors and our patrons. Our patrons are people who've gone to patreon.com. That's patreon.com. And they've searched for a Green Future, saw our page come up there, and signed up. Did the noble thing, did the supporting thing for this show, and they every month a little bit barely noticeable comes out of their checking account and comes over to us, and we're really grateful for that. It helps us keep the show on the air. Now, by way of public announcement, I wanted to mention, and if anyone has a public announcement on anything that's environmentally related, we'd be happy to repeat it here for you on For a Green Future. There is something from the Wood County Park District. They are having something called Wild Lights, and that is a festive Lights After Christmas display. It's going to be at the W.W. Knight Nature Preserve in Perrysburg. It's going to run January 8th through 10th. And what it is a contest where people make life-sized 3D animals with lights. And the displays will be part of that contest. It's free to enter. There's 9 slots for you to compete in. So if you have an artistic bent and you like to, if you always liked building animals out of Christmas tree lights, and here's your chance now. Someone's actually asking you to do it. There's prizes: $100 first prize, $50 second and third prize, and $25 or $50 second prize, $25 third prize. And just go to wcparks.org for the entrance form and all the details. Okay, Russell, have we been joined by my co-host, Rebecca Wood, yet? Okay, well, all right. Well, that's too bad, but we will press on. And, don't let that stop you from trying to connect at 866-240-1065. And we'll go on to the Eco News and Views segment of the show. Several things to report on this week, so we won't have any trouble filling the time Rebecca would be on the air, but I hope, but it won't be the same. It just won't be the same without Rebecca. I really enjoy her help every week. One thing I wanted to report on or talk about for a little bit, and you could hop in on this one too if you saw this. Nova had a show called Can We Cool the Planet? And it was all about geoengineering, which is we were talking about mad scientists wanting to engineer Mars by blowing up nuclear bombs over the poles to vaporize the poles and put them into the atmosphere. That's unfortunately, that brand of craziness isn't relegated to Mars. There are people who want to do this sort of thing to the planet Earth also, and they want to do it to counter global warming. Now, there's many different big problems with this, but this show, Nova's episode, Can We Cool the Planet, kind of gives you the feeling that, we're going to have to do this, that it's a kind of inevitable. Unfortunately, it was biased in a lot of very subtle ways, and the explanation for this bias is very simple. One of their sponsors is Koch Industries. That's the coal industry. And like I say, the bias was presented subtly. For example, there's been an X Prize offered for capturing CO2, for technologies that might help capture CO2. And there was a competition, and there were 5 finalists. And the only finalist that this episode of Nova talked about was the finalist that used coal fly ash to capture CO2. Now, fly ash is what you have left after you've burned coal. It's the stuff at the bottom of the incinerator. So, you got to burn coal to get fly ash. So a technology that uses fly ash to absorb coal, to absorb CO2, has a big strike against it right off the bat. The second, what this finalist did was use the coal ash, mixed it with CO2, and then mixed that to make cement, to make concrete. And that process, cement making, has emits a lot of CO2 itself. But the thing about coal ash is that it's highly toxic. They didn't mention this in the Nova show episode. Fly ash is full of heavy metals like lead and mercury and cadmium, and it's poisonous. So you really don't want to make cement, which people might come in contact with fly ash, because you will be contaminating the cement. And anybody who knows about cement knows that you've sealed it in a building, it's not going to hurt anybody or touch anything. That's wrong, because eventually buildings collapse. There's disasters, there's fires, there's just buildings get abandoned, and then all that toxic stuff in the fly ash would get released into the environment and would poison us. And the example of the bias is that they only talked about that one out of the 5 finalists. And I'm like, what were the other 4 ideas? Were they any good? I don't know, because they didn't talk about it. There's a few right out inaccuracies in that Nova episode. One is a scientist said that the CO2 we're putting into the air is going to be with us for thousands of years. Now, there's a lot of controversy about this number. The idea that once we stop putting CO2 in, how long is it going to take to get out of the air? The research I put a lot of faith in says 200 years, which is a long time in human terms, but it's not unattainable. Some scientists have said as many as thousands of years, but they're in a minority. If you like, I think the safest bet is to go with NASA's estimates, and NASA estimates 300 to 1,000 years, which is a long time, but it doesn't come out at a uniform rate. Most of it comes out quickly. Most of it, over half of it, will be out in that first couple hundred years, and then the rest of it comes out in a slower, at a slower pace. Basically, the stuff, a lot of it gets absorbed quickly, and then it tapers off. It doesn't end. It's not a nice smooth line. So this idea that carbon capture technologies are inevitable is not necessarily true. And the main thing, of course, is that what we have to do, first of all, is stop putting CO2 in the air. And any excuse we've got, any technology that lets us keep burning coal and stuff, is insane. And one other kind of technology they talked about, and they gave a whole bunch of examples, is the sun blocking technology. It's the idea that we're going to shade the Earth and cool it down, and this will not work. And the reason it will not work is the problem isn't too much heat coming in from the sun. The problem is not enough heat escaping back out into the atmosphere. And if you shade the Earth, you slow down photosynthesis, because plants use that sunlight to capture carbon, and plants capturing carbon is the best possible carbon absorber. And so if you slow that process down, you're going to make carbon dioxide concentration, is going to make global warming worse. So that NOVA, sponsored by the Koch brothers, talking about CO2, it's not the NOVA of the 1970s. I remember NOVA when I was a kid. It would really get technical, and it was very unbiased. And now they've got these biases in there. And one final thing that I wanted to talk about was they did mention reforesting the planet. And it was presented by the people who want to do it. And that's probably our best solution for getting excess CO2 out of the atmosphere. The problem is they said that one was controversial. They didn't say any of these other technologies had generated a lot of controversy, but somehow they said tree planting was super controversial, and then they just left it like that. So not a good. The question, can we cool the planet by NOVA? That's the wrong question. The question is, how do we stop putting CO2 in the air? So what did you think? Did you see the episode? Give us a call at 866-240-1065. Another show that's come out recently, there's a movie out called Radium Girls, and I watched that last night. Radium Girls, the story of the Radium Girls is an incredibly heartbreaking story. Back at the beginning of the 20th century, they thought radiation was this wonderful, energizing thing. They thought that getting radiated was as good for you as electricity was good for running a streetcar or something like that. They thought it was invigorating to get irradiated because it's energy. You're putting energy into your system. It must be good for you, right? And so the radium industry went full bore, exposing people and irradiating people. And one of the products they created were glow-in-the-dark watch faces. And these watch faces, the numbers on the dials were painted by women using hand paintbrushes, and they would lick the brushes and put them in the paint, and then paint the numbers on the dial. And what happened is that these women were exposed to incredible amounts of radiation by today's standards. Back then, they were considered. It was considered to be so vanishingly small. The amount of radium in the paint was considered so minuscule that they couldn't even fathom the idea that such a tiny amount of anything could cause health effects. But of course it did, and the movie is okay. The thing is that it mixes the radium question up with a whole bunch of other questions. It mixes it up with the question of racism. It mixes it up with the question of communism and socialism and suffrage, women's suffrage, and all the things that were happening back then early part of the 20th century, it kind of puts it all into a big melange. And the book Radium Girls, I think, did a better job of capturing the horror of what was happening to these women. And they were literally being dissolved from the inside because the radium got into their bones and literally tore their flesh and their bones and their muscles. The radiation from the radium dissolved them. And the horror of that was captured in the media of the day, in newspaper stories and in photographs. And this movie kind of looked away from that. I mean, that time in the early 20th century, before there were even antibiotics, people were used to death. You know, there were flu epidemics. There were diseases like tuberculosis where loved ones would just die, these slow, agonizing deaths. But the fundamental horror of radiation poisoning was enough to grab the whole world's attention. And they cover in the movie that people got sent a lot of letters, but really the whole nation was tied up in the fate of these poor young women who should have been at the peak of their lives in terms of health and beauty. And their bones, there were, in the book Radium Girls, they describe one of the girls who was involved in the lawsuit, her lower jaw completely dissolved. She had no lower jaw because of the radiation poisoning. And I was kind of hoping a movie, with Hollywood and all that, would capture some of that horror, but it didn't. It kind of looked away from it. And I don't think we can look away, because I think that we have to remember that this industry, the nuclear industry, got its start with lying, got its start pretending that it was harmless, pretending that it was beneficial, and instead it was as horrible a death as you could imagine for these poor Radium Girls. So I would recommend watching it. It's available on Amazon Prime. Right now you do have to rent it, but I'd more recommend that you read the book Radium Girls with the same title, because I think that does a better job of capturing the horror. And of course the nuclear industry today still uses all the same techniques that American Radium and the nuclear industry did back in the early part of the 20th century. So in a way we've come a long ways, and in other ways we're still being able to be fooled in the same way. And one of the things that happened to the Radium Girls, and they said this in the movie, but they needed to show it. This is something we really needed to see, is that literally so much radium, which chemically is similar to calcium, so radium concentrates in the bone the same way calcium does. Literally, these women, you could see their bones glowing in the dark through their skin. And this is where the whole idea that people who get radiation exposure glow in the dark, they literally did. And that kind of horrific vision, I think, needed to be included in this movie, and it wasn't. But moving on, we have a victory to report against the nuclear industry. This is a really big thing that happened here, and we have had on our show several times a representative from the Nuclear Information Resource Service, Diane DeRigo, talking about the Trump administration's plan to reclassify high-level radioactive waste as not high-level radioactive waste. Simply, it's still just as radioactive, but now it just won't be defined as radioactive, and so it can be dumped in regular dumps or tossed out back in a ditch or whatever you want to do with it. That policy has been withdrawn. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is no longer proposing to reclassify highly radioactive waste as not highly radioactive waste. So this is a big victory. And yeah, I mean, last week in terms of victory versus not losing, this is such a big not losing that I think we can count this one as a victory. I mean, we keep the same policies in place, so we didn't actually gain ground. We didn't get more strict radiation standards. But if this had gone through, the whole country would have been irradiated incredibly. And so this was a big victory. And unfortunately, I suspect part of it is actually a little bit of peak on the Trump administration's part, because Biden has said that he wants part of his global warming strategy to be pushing small modular reactors. Hundreds and thousands of these smaller reactors instead of hundreds of the big ones. But they're still the same kind of reactor, and they still produce the same waste. So if this had gone through, this would have become much simpler for Biden. It would have been much easier for Biden to push small modular reactors, because you wouldn't have to worry about what to do with them once they were done and once they were irradiated. You could just dump them into your local neighborhood dump. So it may be that the Trump administration was just like, let's just make things a little tougher for the Biden administration. And whatever the reason, it's good that they withdrew it. All right, that brings us to an update on legislation right here in Ohio. The whole House Bill 798, House 104, nuclear stuff. There has been 798, House Bill 798, which is the fake repeal House Bill 6 law. That's a bill that would just push the charges back a year, and it's let's push it back and hope everybody forgets about it. Forgets about House Bill 6 law. House Bill 788 did come out of committee. It passed committee. The vote was 7-8, and it has not yet been voted on by the full Ohio legislature. They say they're going to come back on Tuesday and vote on it. The legislative session was supposed to be over, but I guess First Energy or Energy Harbor must have coughed up some extra dough, because they're going to come back on Tuesday and vote on it after all. And of course, this is the bill that First Energy and Energy Harbor really want to pass, and they've spent $65 million bribing people to get it through. And it's unclear if it's going to pass. I'm not sure. There's still it should not pass. Most Ohioans don't want it. It's bad policy, and it did manage to come out of committee, but the actual vote is apparently going to be pushed off till Tuesday. And one note about House Bill 6, one little story that I don't think I've related here before. I spoke against it when it was House Bill 6 way back in 2019. I was at the very first public hearing on it, and I spoke second at those hearings, and the person who spoke first was a representative of American Electric Power. And American Electric Power, the representative got up there and said, this bailout for nuclear plants, and originally it was just for nuclear plants, it's not fair to us coal plant people. It's because we have coal plants, so it's not fair to bail out nuke plants. He said, and here's the quote, but I look forward to working with the committee to draft a better version of the bill. And the subcommittee I was speaking at was being chaired by Representative Dick Stein. He's a Republican, and he started drooling. I could just see this light in his eyes, and he tilted forward, and he was like, oh yes, AEP, yeah, we'd love to work with you. And lo and behold, a few weeks later, coal plant bailouts were added to the nuke plant bailout bill. And so it's a question. The only question is how much money changed hands, and how much does it cost to buy our legislators? And it's a terrible bill. House Bill 6 is a terrible bill from inception to execution. Unfortunately, it does look like at this point the bill is going to be executed. Starting in January, you are going to be charged extra money to pay for nuclear and coal plants in the state of Ohio. So, but that's no reason to stop fighting. We've got to keep fighting it. We've got to reverse it. because this cannot be allowed to stand. One thing that does stand, though, is we do know that eventually we're going to win all these battles, and eventually we're going to get to a green, healthy future. And I'm sure if Rebecca were here, she'd be asking me, how do you know that, Joe? And the answer is that I get a letter from the future every week from my great-great-granddaughter, Marie I. And here's this week's letter. Dear GGG, well, here we are with my penultimate letter. Looking back over the past 2 years, it's hard to believe the difference. When I got here, we all believed that in just a few months we would be injecting nuclear wastes deep into the Earth's crust, finally solving the nuclear waste problem people of your time created. But here we are, 2 years later, and the first rad has yet to enter the ground. I feel much older than 2 years. Surviving a dirigible crash, traveling to Mars, losing my baby, almost dying from radiation sickness, and now getting married, I feel like I've aged 50 years, not 2. Speaking of 2, just 2 more days until the wedding. I may feel much older, but at least thinking of that makes me happy. Writing to you also makes me happy, GGG. I'm going to miss that. One more letter. Love, Marie I. So there you go. And I'd like to ask people, what did you think of all our letters from the future? They're wrapping up, but did you enjoy them? Were they a good thing? Give us a call at 419-973-5841. You can call or text that number. And don't forget, you can email us at joe@joedemare4agreenfuture.org. And, of course, you can always go back and watch and listen to these episodes on YouTube and as a podcast. Thanks so much for listening. This is Joe DeMare, signing off.
The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want that.